The Grimm brothers, who lived in the 18th and 19th century, were, as it happens, professors. That's not the only thing that made them weird. In fact, they lived together almost their entire lives. Jakob was born in 1785, and he was a rather active fellow, stayed a bachelor his whole life, and was the chief compiler of their tales. Wilhelm was born a year later, was sickly, but he married, and he was the chief rewriter of their tales. Their tales? Well, in theory, what the Grimm brothers did was go around to the farms in the areas near where they lived in Germany and talk to people, in theory, illiterate people, to find the stories that had somehow passed through the sieve of history. That is, if an illiterate grandmother were telling a story to her grandchildren that she had learned from her illiterate grandmother, which she in turn had learned from her illiterate grandmother, these stories must go back to the very beginnings of culture. Now, it's true that there were people who were trying to collect fairy tales before the Grimm brothers did. They did them with specific reasons. Charles Perrault collected them in order to have entertainments to read at court, and his versions of things like Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella are, in fact, highly, highly literate. However, the Grimm brothers had something else in mind. Remember, Germany was not a country, as we know it today, until after the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-71. Germany was the name of a collection of different city-states, principalities, duchies, and so on, where people mostly spoke German. England, France, these were already well-developed modern nations by the beginning of the 19th century. Germans wanted to emulate them. Greece, Rome, were the great countries of the classic era. Germany wanted to take its place alongside them as well. The Grimm brothers sought to collect stories that would demonstrate the purity and antiquity of the German folk. These stories were meant to bind the German-speaking peoples together and to show that they spoke for the oldest roots of humanity. So their books were Kinder- und Hausmärchen, Children and Household Tales, published in 3 volumes in 1812, 1814, and 1822. Instantly they became enormously popular all over Europe. In 1823, George Cruikshank published an illustrated edition of all of the tales that had come out. There were translations by one person and another. I've asked you to read the Lucy Crane translation, if you find that convenient, from 1886. We now, that is the wide public, associate the Grimm brothers with these fairy tales, but in fact, that is not their only scholarly contribution. Phonology is the study of the development of language sounds. And the Grimm brothers, particularly Jakob, were instrumental in coming up with the very first law of phonological change. Now, let me see if I can make this palpable. If you say the word voices, voices, and hold your voice box, when you say the S sound in voice, your voice box doesn't move. But when you say the Z sound at the end of voices, you can feel the vibration in your voice box. Speech sounds that use your voice box are called voiced. Speech sounds that do not use your voice box are called voiceless. The Grimm brothers noticed something that anyone who speaks a large number of European languages would note, that there are connections that seem to be regular changes between some languages and others. What they realized was that if you go far enough back, say to Latin, you will find words that are voiceless stops. That is, they are produced by stopping the air and then releasing it, like p, p. If you look at the development of Romance languages, that is, the languages that are based on Latin, the language of Rome, those languages retain that very same sound in words that have the consonant in the same place. So, pater in Latin remains padre in Spanish. But if you move to the Germanic languages, German, English, Frisian, Dutch, those initial voiceless stops become voiceless fricatives. That is, sounds that are made by friction. So, pater becomes père in French, padre in Spanish, but father in English, and Vater in German. There are only 3 voiceless stops, p, t, k, PTK. Pater becomes father, tres becomes toi in French, tres in Spanish, but 3 in English. And cornu, as in cornucopia, becomes horn in English, but remains k, as in cuerno in Spanish. In other words, you can find an absolutely regular shift in the phonology as you go from some other language and they split into Germanic languages and Latinate languages. This means it's possible to trace back to some hypothetical earlier language and know how it was pronounced. This is the first phonological law. Now, why were they concerned with this? Well, if you trace back to a common origin for, say, German and French, and it turns out you go back for a common origin between, say, Sanskrit and Hindi, you can keep right on going all the way back until you get to a single earlier language spoken between the 5th and 7th millennia before this era, called Indo-European. And that language is the oldest one to which we, who might speak English or French, have access. What the Grimm brothers were trying to do in studying linguistics was show the direct line back from German to something that even predated Greek and Latin, so that the Greeks and the Latins, those classic countries, had no real advantage in antiquity over the German. You know, when you study the meanings of words, one of the things that one often does is study etymology. Etymology, most people define as the study of the history of words. And that's a very useful thing to do because our words have in them meanings that we might not really recognize, but somehow they're still in there. The fancy word for England is Albion. And it's called Albion because when the Romans first got to the British Isles and they came toward what we now call the White Cliffs of Dover, the land seemed miraculous because it was all white. And Alba is white in Latin. So that word Albion doesn't mean, oh, a crummy way of looking at England. It means a wonderful way of looking at England. And you understand that better if you understand the etymology of the word Albion. So you might think, ology means the study of, etymon might mean history or words, but it doesn't. Theology means study of, but the Greek word etymon means truth. Somehow, there is an intuitive belief that most people share that if you understand how something began, you understand what it really, really is. The truth of the words are in understanding their history. The truth of the culture is in understanding the history of its language. The truth of human culture is in finding those ever further back stories that the Grimm brothers sought. In fact, they lied. We know that they sent their graduate students out to collect stories, and they gave them to Jacob, and Jacob put together the stories that seemed like they might go together, and then he gave the draft to Wilhelm, and Wilhelm rewrote the stories so that they would look appealing. He had in mind Charles Perrault and lots of other collections of folk tales or fairy tales that they'd already seen. Nominally, these were tales from antiquity. In fact, the largest single source was a middle-class housewife who lived a couple of blocks down from them in Germany, and we know this because we have access to their library and hers. Why did this matter so much? As I say, it was a nationalist project. In the year 9 of our era, a Germanic warrior named Arminius led a group of Germanic people to attack 3 full Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest near modern-day Osnabrück. It was a 3-day encounter, but in one day, the Germans under Arminius wiped out all 3 legions. At that time, and for most of the centuries thereafter, Rome had about 28 legions. In other words, 10%, more than 10% of the military might of Rome was destroyed on one day in Teutoburg Forest in 9 of this era. The Romans never again tried to attack what they called Germania. And to this day, a line that goes east of the Rhine and north of the Danube separates 2 cultures in Europe. If you like, you can call it the oil and butter line. On the west of the line and the south of the line, people cook with oil. On the right, on the east, I should say, and the north, they cook with butter. Or you can call it the beer and wine line, right? They have beer north and east of the Danube and the Rhine. They have wine in the other areas. Those cultural realities stick with us to this day. In the year 98, Tacitus published a booklet which talked about these Germanic people. He referred to them as tall, strong, uncorruptible, mighty warriors. Probably what he was trying to do was use the fear of attacking north of the Danube as a way to get his fellow citizens, the Romans of his day, to be less lazy and more militaristic, because he was trying to drum up their own political vigor. But in fact, the story of Germania, Tacitus' description of what the Germans were like, although he probably had never met one and certainly had never gone to Germany or to the area of all of those states that he collectively called Germania, the existence of this booklet became a myth for German-speaking people. And in the year 1455, a copy of that book was found. And almost immediately, German-speaking people used this as a justification for trying to become stronger and unify and make themselves into this great nation. As part of that effort, many people participated, and so did the Grimm brothers. They didn't collect their fairy tales, their Kinder- und Hausmärchen, because they were trying to please children. They collected them because they were trying to show the might, antiquity, power and uncorruptibility of the German people. Those are the stories you've just been reading.